Next, I want to look at problems 4, 5, and 6 on the Lesson 7-1 Intro practice problems. Again, I've got secant of theta times the cotangent of theta. If I change this to sines and cosines, the secant is equal to 1 over the cosine, and that's based on one of the reciprocal identities. Secant equals 1 over cosine. And the cotangent is equal to cosine over sine. And if I multiply those two fractions, I can see that my cosines are going to cancel. And so I end up with 1 over the sine, which is equal to the cosecant of theta. So that's it for number 4. For number 5, I'm using the same strategy, change things to sines and cosines. And in this case, I have a secant squared. And I mentioned in class that the secant is equal to 1 over the cosine. That's the reciprocal identity for the secant. And if you square both sides of that, secant equals 1 over cosine, it becomes secant squared equals 1 over the cosine squared. So I can replace the secant squared with 1 over the cosine squared. Multiplying that by the cosine over 1, I end up with cosine, 1 times the cosine, over cosine squared, which again you can think of it as cosine times cosine. So you've got a factor of the cosine that will cancel in the numerator and denominator. Notice that leaves a factor of cosine in the denominator, but we need a 1 still, or to consider that there is still a 1 in the top of that fraction. So this is 1 over the cosine, which is equivalent to simply the secant of theta. For number 6, we have tangent squared times cosecant squared. Again, the reciprocal identities and the quotient identities are all also true for squared functions. So I can replace, since the tangent is equal to the sine over the cosine, tangent squared is equal to sine squared over cosine squared. And since the cosecant is equal to 1 over the sine, the cosecant squared can be replaced with 1 over the sine squared. My sine squareds cancel and leave me with 1 over the cosine squared. And since 1 over the cosine is equal to the secant, that's that reciprocal identity, 1 over the cosine squared is equal to the secant squared.